Good evening, I'm Kojo Namdi. Welcome to Evening Exchange. Dream Makers, Dream Breakers, the world of Justice Thurgood Marshall. It's a riveting, unauthorized biography that chronicles the life and times of the first black justice of the United States Supreme Court. Our guest for this hour and the book's author, Carl Rowan, shared a special friendship with the late Associate Justice that spanned some 40 years. Mr. Rowan is himself a legend in his own time. He is a former ambassador with some 5 Emmys under his belt, a newspaperman, of course, 44 honorary degrees, and a host of other accolades. Carl Rowan, welcome once again to Evening Exchange.
It's always great to come talk with you.
First and foremost, why is this an unauthorized biography? Given the nature of your relationship with Justice Marshall, there were those who might have expected that he would have wanted to put his blessing on this biography, and there are those who say this is the closest we'll ever come to an autobiography.
Well, you know, when you are doing an authorized book, there's some implication that you let the man read what you've written about his life and let him tell you what he wants you to take out and that sort of stuff. Well, there was none of this. The Marshalls got a chance to read the book the same time the public did. And I think it's better when you're a journalist doing a biography to have it unauthorized, because it says something to the public about what's in the book.
Well, it's clear that you are an admirer of Justice Thurgood Marshall and his brilliant career. What did he think about it, and his wife? Did he have a chance to read it before he passed?
Mrs. Marshall read it. I doubt very much that he did, but I'm sure she read him passages. And I know he saw some of the early reviews, and she called me to say that she was very pleased with the book.
Well, we will discuss that later because it deals with some of the escapades, shall we say, of Thurgood Marshall's youth, all of which are not the most exemplary of behavior that you'd expect from a young person. But why did you select this name, Dream Makers, Dream Breakers?
Because you can't take the measure of a man by looking at him in a vacuum. Nobody lives in a vacuum. You've got to see what the issues were, who was helping him, and who was trying to hinder him. So we had some dream makers: Earl Warren, Harry Truman, Eleanor Roosevelt. There were a lot of dream breakers, some still around, like Strom Thurmond, George Wallace, Ronald Reagan, whom Justice Marshall rated at the bottom of all the American presidents.
Let's talk about that, because while he rated Eleanor Roosevelt a dream maker, it is arguable that he rated her husband, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as a dream breaker. He did not have a great deal of affection for President Roosevelt.
No, he did not. He thought Roosevelt was totally beholden to the Southerners who control most of the key committees in the Congress. He believed that war was coming, and he had to have their support for the mobilization. So he would not get out on any limb in terms of supporting a Fair Employment Practices Law or anti-lynching legislation and so forth. But I think the thing that really got to Justice Marshall was that one day he was sitting in the office of Attorney General Biddle talking about a murder case in which a black man was involved. And Biddle wanted to call President Roosevelt.
This had to do with a back shooting of a sheriff in Virginia.
In Virginia, that is correct. And when he called President Roosevelt up at Hyde Park and mentioned this case, well, first he'd said to Marshall, get on the extension, I want you to hear what the president says we can do. Well, the first thing Marshall hears is Roosevelt saying, this is the last time I'm going to tell you not to call me about any of Eleanor's niggers. And Thurgood Marshall never forgot it.
His mind was made up. You refer in exclamation marks in the next sentence. You say, Eleanor's niggers, and then you go on to explain how it is that a first lady, while supporting her husband, can differ fairly sharply with him on some very important issues and what that meant. How was Eleanor Roosevelt different in that regard than her husband?
Well, first of all, she was a very independent woman, and when she believed in something, she'd stick her neck out. I mean, when they had in Detroit the worst riots this country had ever had just after World War II. She went to Detroit to give the speech at the NAACP Freedom Fund dinner because she thought that was important for a First Lady to do in cooling the racial passions. And when the ladies of the DAR did not let Marian Anderson sing at Constitution Hall, she said she wanted to be the one to go to Richmond to the NAACP convention and give the Spingarn Medal to Marian Anderson. So she knew that she was doing things that he wouldn't do or couldn't do.
And didn't necessarily approve of.
No, but he would tell people, I can't do anything with her anyhow. And so here was a man admitting how little power he had over his wife.
Justice Marshall felt that any benefit that black people had as a result of the Roosevelt administration policies were not necessarily intended for us, but were incidental. However, we now have an administration in which once again we have a Democratic president who is being accused of tending too much towards moderation, while his wife, Hillary Rodham Clinton, is generally perceived as more liberal to the left of her husband, more sensitive on issues, on social issues, and she has said one of her proudest moments is being compared to Mrs. Roosevelt. Do you see a comparison here?
Yes, I see a comparison. I mean, they've already begun to call Mrs. Clinton nasty names, just as they called Mrs. Roosevelt Madam Gadabout, the first communist. They called her a nigger lover, everything you could be called. And I think Mrs. Clinton had better be prepared to hear some bad names thrown at her.
Is Mrs. Clinton more openly politically active than Mrs. Roosevelt was?
In a way, Mrs. Roosevelt, for example, never was given any monumental task compared with what Mrs. Clinton is trying to do in terms of health care reform in this country. And most of her activities with regard to the government were done behind the scenes. I mean, she, when people in the NAACP, Thurgood Marshall, for example, wanted to see that a new housing project in West Virginia was not Jim Crow, he called Mrs. Roosevelt, and Mrs. Roosevelt saw that some of the first residents in that housing project were black.
So she may not have had the kind of official designation that Hillary Rodham Clinton has, but she was able to perform in many respects a similar role.
Yes.
So much for the dream makers and dream breakers for the time being, but now back to Justice Marshall's upbringing. You make the point in the book that if anybody could figure out why a young man who came from a two-parent, really in terms of the black community, upper middle class family, should have been as badly behaved and as rambunctious as he would as a young man, if anybody could figure that out, then they'd be able to figure out all of the problems we have with some of the youth in our inner cities today.
Well, that's right. We wouldn't have any juvenile delinquency or
Was he
any...
that bad?
Well, he admitted that he was kind of a scoundrel. He took advantage of the fact that his mother was a teacher, so he'd cut up in school knowing that they weren't going to throw him out because that would offend his mother too much. So they had to resort to things like sending him down to the basement of the school with a copy of the Constitution and an assignment to memorize it, to try to get to him. But he still, at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, the night before exams, everybody was trying to cram, and Thurgood Marshall was going around trying to see who would join him in a game of poker or pinochle. And one of the stories I liked the best that he told me was after he met this young lady, Vivian Bury, and decided he wanted to marry her, he invited her and her parents to come to Baltimore to meet his relatives. His Uncle
I love
Fearless,
his uncle's name.
Uncle Fearless took this young lady, Vivian Bury, aside and said, "You seem like a very nice young woman, and I've got to tell you something. Thurgood always was a bum, he is a bum, and he always will be a bum.
And Carl Rowan asked Justice Marshall, he said, was your uncle Fearless serious? What did he respond?
He says, hell no. When he died, he didn't leave me a penny. He gave $36,000 to Catholic charities and nothing to me.
So he was clearly serious about him.
Yes, but I think Justice Marshall could tell that story with some pride that he eventually proved Uncle Fearless wrong.
There's another story that you cleared up in this book, and there are those biographers who say that there is no hard evidence that Justice Thurgood Marshall ever applied to the University of Maryland Law School. You say, yes, he did apply, and he did receive a response from the president of that school.
And he most certainly did, and then, as soon as he got out of Howard Law School, he found a young man, Donald Murray, and said, apply to that law school. The regents held an emergency meeting and decided not to admit him. Well, Marshall was very clever, even at that young age. He didn't want them to fall back on some excuse that Murray had lousy grades or he had halitosis or something. He walked into the president's office and demanded to read the minutes of that emergency meeting of the board. They said he couldn't. He wouldn't leave till they let him read those minutes. He saw in there the very clear statement that he was of African descent and therefore Murray couldn't be admitted. Marshall and Charlie Houston took those minutes into court in Baltimore and in one day got a writ saying that they had to admit Donald Murray.
One of his greater revenge victories. But you mentioned Charlie Houston, and that gives me the opportunity to bring up another issue of documents which we are normally not allowed access to, which you, with the permission of the Legal Defense Fund, were admitted access to, which indicates the kind of thing that was going on in the NAACP when Thurgood Marshall first thought of joining the NAACP. We had at that point, the secretary of the NAACP was Walter White, and its founder and the editor of its crisis magazine, W.E.B. Du Bois. Could you tell our viewers the nature of the dispute that was taking place between those two men? Please believe me, this is as important today as it was back in 1934.
Yes, well, you know, I'd been brought up, as most of us have, believing that Du Bois was the great radical, never compromised with evil in any form, and that Booker T. Washington was the Uncle Tom, etc. Well, I get in these files at the Library of Congress and find out that Du Bois is arguing for a compromise with segregation. And Walter White is absolutely against any compromise. Walter White wrote an article for the Crisis magazine. Du Bois sends him a letter saying, I won't print your article. Now, nominally, Walter White was Du Bois' boss, except Du Bois was the kind of guy who never thought anybody could be his boss. But Thurgood Marshall watched this with interest and passion, this battle between the two, because he'd already made up his mind that the only justice is when everybody gets the same thing in the same place at the same time.
And up until that point, I say Du Bois. Du Bois is, of course, correct. We've anglicized his name over the time to Du Bois. But up until that time, he, like you, tended to think of W.E.B. Du Bois as the radical, but was shocked when he read what he had to say and didn't want to go into the NAACP if Du Bois would hold sway in that discussion. His mentor, Mr. Houston, helped.
Oh, yes, and Houston and Hasty, Judge Hasty also. In fact, Hasty wrote about Du Bois one of the most cutting, I'd say nasty, articles that I've ever seen. He called Du Bois Esau, the guy who was selling black people out for a mess of
I want to stay with that discussion for a second, because you say that in Du Bois' writing, he represented the intellectual schizophrenia that was current at that time, because he was making the argument, and a few people who supported it at the time, that if there were not that if they were fully committed to all desegregation, then it might result in losing black colleges and losing black churches. And Walter White made the argument that we cannot compromise on these issues. Others were saying that, well, you know, the black intellectual elite of this time is tending towards cultural nationalism, wanting to see its own institutions, and we have to accommodate that. A lot of the same discussion is taking place today.
Well, it goes on in every generation.
And people need to know that.
For example, the most prominent black in Texas probably was Carter Wesley, the publisher of the newspaper in Houston, the black newspaper. When Marshall made a move to desegregate the University of Texas, Carter wrote a big editorial suggesting that a bunch of nuts were running the NAACP, that they ought to concentrate on trying to get the state to put some money into a college for blacks rather than try to get blacks in the University of Texas. Marshall flew to Texas in a hurry and went to the state convention and took on Carter Wesley and won the convention over to an all-out frontal assault on segregation. You come up to, I was just reading yesterday, a 1960 debate between Bayard Rustin and Malcolm X. Malcolm X wanted to say, okay, white people, we've been good slaves, you owe us something, give us 2 states, and we blacks will move into those 2 states and you can have the rest of the United States. And of course, Bayard Rustin was already by then planning the Great March on Washington and an assault on segregation through a Public Accommodations Act and so forth.
And of course, throughout his career, Justice Marshall never equivocated on his position in opposition to segregation and for desegregation. But it becomes a little bit complicated nowadays when we see, I think it's the Mabus versus Mississippi case, in which now these southern states are claiming, well, we have opened admissions to our schools, and therefore these black schools no longer necessarily need to exist. They can get into the major white schools.
Well, you know, it may be complicated, but I have always taken the position that integration must not mean the destruction of everything black and meld it into whatever is white. And they came after a lot of lawsuits in Tennessee. They finally came to the conclusion that they could close down the white branch of the University of Tennessee in Nashville and put the great computer center at Tennessee State, put the School of Nursing at Tennessee State, with the result that all of a sudden 1/3 of the enrollment at Tennessee State is white. And the problem with Mississippi is they've got a nut for governor, Fordyce, who doesn't want a resolution of the problem in that state.
In our next segment, we will discuss the use of the term nut, but before we move on, another issue which people today might be a little surprised at is what happened with Walter White, who everybody agrees looked more like a white man than he did a black man, but had been married to a black woman for 27 years. Tell our viewers about the uproar it caused in the NAACP when Walter White decided to make a different move.
Well, one of the interesting things I found in those files in the Library of Congress is that a lot of people wrote letters attacking Walter White, people who I'm sure would never want the public to know that they'd written some of the things they wrote. The president, big insurance company, writes, "The white man has been saying all along that all of our efforts are to get black men in the bed with white women, and Walter White has taken steps to prove they're right." And
this was by marrying a white woman.
That's correct. And they wanted to throw him out. The Norfolk Journal and Guide ran editorials saying that by marrying a white woman, Walter White had lost his usefulness to the NAACP.
I say that because today so many people think of the NAACP as a moderate organization. They might not be aware of the level of race sentiment that existed in the organization that caused then Justice Marshall to have to circulate a memo among the internal staff of the NAACP. Tell us about that.
Yes, he sent a memo in effect telling the staff, keep your mouth closed. If anybody calls and asks you anything about Walter White marrying a white woman, you don't know anything, so shut up.
Was it affecting staff morale in any way? Were people saying that the organization won't be able to be as effective as it used to be and therefore I want to leave?
There were a lot of people saying that, and there was a lot of bitterness. But again, people like Bill Hasty stood up for the principles that the NAACP had been standing for, and some people said, you don't marry a race, you marry an individual.
Big issue, and I say that on Evening Exchange, I don't want to bring up with people issues as personal of the ethnicity as the race of whom they're married to, not knowing that this was an explosion within the NAACP so many years ago. More with syndicated columnist and author Carl Rowan about his new book, Dream Makers, Dream Breakers, when we return. Welcome back. We're talking with esteemed columnist and author Carl Rowan about his latest book, Dream Makers, Dream Breakers, about the life and times of Justice Thurgood Marshall. Mr. Rowan has had a special friendship with Justice Marshall for more than 40 years. Nevertheless, he wanted some distance in this biography, and so it is not an authorized biography. You mentioned the word nut in our previous segment, and I remember that term being used to describe an esteemed psychologist who was in the entourage of Justice Thurgood Marshall when he was traveling down south to fight a case. Could you tell our viewers?
Oh yes, that was a classic moment. The case was Briggs versus Elliott, which became a central part of what we now know as Brown versus Board of Education. It was a case in which a black family in rural area, Clarendon County, was trying to break up the Jim Crow school system. Marshall and a large entourage went to Charleston to argue before a 3-judge federal panel. As the train arrived in Charleston, Marshall was standing there with his friend and fellow lawyer Spotswood Robinson. And suddenly they heard this cry, "Don't let the train leave, my dolls are still on it." And Spots turned around and sees this guy, this slender black man, walk off with a white doll under one arm and a black doll under the other. And he said, "Thurgood, who's that nut with the 2 dolls under his arm?" Marshall said, "That's Mr. Stigmatic Injury." He says, "What?" "That's the guy who's going to prove stigmatic injury. He's going to help us prove that when the state says to a black child, you may not go to school with white children, that stigmatizes the black child, wounds that child's heart and mind for the rest of its life." Well, they finally got the Supreme Court to accept that argument and put stigmatic injury in the vocabulary of the American judiciary. In fact, recently I was interviewing Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, and she began to talk about stigmatic injury.
It also made the name Kenneth Clark a household word, certainly in the black community in this country.
Absolutely, because as an esteemed psychologist, he played a tremendous role in all these battles against Jim Crow.
A lot of people have heard and will read about many of the battles that Justice Marshall fought as a lawyer for the NAACP and the difficulties he had to go through with that. Let us talk, therefore, a little bit about the period after that, the period during which he became a judge on the Court of Appeals, Solicitor General, and ultimately a Supreme Court Justice. He didn't know this, but you were able to elicit information that indicated that Lyndon Johnson had this plan in mind all along.
Oh, absolutely. This was classic Lyndon Johnson. He said to one of his aides, Jack Valenti, "I could put him on the Supreme Court right now. We need to have a Negro on the Supreme Court, but I know the Southern senators, they're going to say he's not qualified. He doesn't know anything but civil rights law. So I'm going to make him Solicitor General, the government's lawyer before the Supreme Court. And by the time I get ready to name him to the Supreme Court, that sumbitch will have argued more cases than anybody in history. And those are Johnson's words. And of course, Johnson did just that. And when he got ready to name him to the Supreme Court, he had all his ducks in line and could control enough Southerners that Marshall could be confirmed.
Nevertheless, there were senators who, from the time his name came up for being on the Court of Appeals, were opposed to him, and one of them still sits in the Senate today, Senator Strom Thurmond. How did he attempt to obstruct?
Well, on the Supreme Court appointment, he went into a filibuster, and then when he was questioning Marshall, he asked hours of absurd questions, such as, do you know on which day and what time of day they ratified the 13th Amendment, and that sort of stuff. And finally he got around and he said to Marshall, what do you know about the black codes? Marshall says, I know one thing. They forbade blacks to fly kites in Maryland. And this just broke up the hearing room, of course.
But from the time his name came up to the time he actually was approved to go to the bench, some 10 or 11 months.
Well, that was for the Second Circuit Court of Appeals.
Okay.
Almost a year. But there's a story behind that, too. Mississippi Senator Eastland chaired the Judiciary Committee. He wouldn't let them hold any hearings because he had a man named Cox in Mississippi. He wanted President Kennedy to make a district judge. Well, Kennedy didn't want to appoint him because he thought Cox was a racist. But one day, Bobby Kennedy runs into the senator on the train going from the Capitol to one of the office buildings. And Eastland said to Bobby Kennedy, you tell your brother that when I get Cox, he gets the nigger. And when President Kennedy named Cox a judge, Eastland permitted the hearings, and Marshall was confirmed.
It is simply amazing. We're going to get into a discussion of how Justice Marshall was evaluated by friend and foe during his tenure on the Supreme Court. But hey, it's time for us to get a little more democratic here. It's time for you to join us in this discussion. It's your turn, caller. Thank you for waiting. You're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Good evening, Coach Joe.
Good evening.
I look at your program all the time. I think it's just wonderful. I am a member of Evening Exchange.
Thank you for all of that.
And I admire Mr. Rowan very much. I see him Saturday Good Evening, Washington.
Inside Washington.
Washington, yes. But what I'm curious to know, I'm a 81-year-old African-American woman, and I'm curious to know why Chief Justice Marshall, who I admire so much, had a white funeral director. I've asked different people, but I don't seem to get any right
funeral
answer.
director. Okay. I don't know if Mr. Rowan can answer that.
I have no knowledge whatsoever of who his funeral director was, but I would think that he would have thought it the right of his relatives to pick any kind of funeral director they wanted to.
Let me raise an issue along that line, because some who are black and have been critical of Justice Marshall have said that during his tenure on the Supreme Court, he only had one black law clerk. A, is that true? And B, given his history, should people have expected more?
Well, I can't tell you if he had only one.
Neither can I.
I know one of them, Karen Hasty. Well, I know that that's not true because another law clerk who worked with me was Crystal Nix, and she would bring documents and stuff out to my house when I called the justice's office to ask for them. You know, people want to read too much into some of these things. It's perfectly proper for him to have black and white, Gentile and Jewish law clerks. I don't think anybody can find any evidence whatsoever that Justice Marshall was putting black people down in any kind of way.
There were also those, his critics, who claimed that he was lazy and that most of his opinions were written by his law clerks. You used an interesting exercise in the book where, on the one hand, you looked at his opinions on various issues that some people will claim were written by law clerks, and then you asked him on the record what were his opinions on those issues. What did you find?
Well, what he wrote in those briefs and what he said to me just in conversation were exactly the same thing. But I thought one of the most compelling bits of evidence that put the lie to that business about his being lazy and law clerks doing all the work, one former clerk said to me that he walked in one day to talk about a very critical case. And he said, "Judge, you have just got to come down on this side." Marshall said, "Say what?" He said, "You've got to come down on this side." He says, "Knucklehead, come over here where you can hear me. I don't have to do a damn thing except stay black and die." And that let the clerk know real fast who was going to make that decision.
So invariably the opinions that we saw, regardless of what input clerks had, represented Justice Marshall's opinion.
Absolutely.
Back to the telephone. It's your turn, caller. You're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Hello, Coach. I just wanted to ask that what was Thurgood Marshall's opinions on, like...
You'll have to speak up a little bit, please.
What was Thurgood Marshall's opinions on kind of limiting the terms on how long Supreme Court justices serve? Because I love the man to death and I'd like to do woody work, but I kind of miss that if he had stepped down during the Carter administration, we wouldn't be in some kind of messes that we're in today. And one of the things that I'm missing is that if he had stepped down earlier, maybe he could have come over to Howard and taught a little bit, lectured a little bit, and he could have passed down a little knowledge because he was so busy fighting the Supreme Court cases and getting it done. I kind of missed out that he didn't get a chance to just teach at a law school or talk to.
Write an autobiography, huh?
Well, let me say that obviously he believed in the life term for Supreme Court justices. This insulates them from the political pressures. I'd hate to have seen a situation where Ronald Reagan or George Bush could have put pressure on the members of the Supreme Court. We'd have had a lot more terrible decisions than we got during those 12 years. Justice Marshall gave more than 50 years of his life to the struggle, and he held on as long as he could. I don't know this, but I rather think that in 1991, if we pundits had not been saying that George Bush was unbeatable and weren't ready to declare him emperor for an extra 4 years, Justice Marshall might have been able to hang on, and then, of course, we'd never have heard of Anita Hill, and there'd have been no Clarence Thomas controversy.
We got to talk about that, too. Back to the telephone. You're on the air, caller. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I would like to know about your opinion about Jesse Jackson with the NAACP move now. What do you think that
His is one of the names that has been speculated on to become the next executive director of the NAACP. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, I am.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I obviously have no input into who gets chosen, and I have no knowledge except that I've read that they're now down to 4 people. Jesse Jackson is a man of great action, and there's no question but what, as executive director, he would bring some badly needed energy to the organization. On the other hand, I know that there are members of the board who think Jesse would bring too much energy to the organization and that he would not accept control by the board of directors. It will be interesting to see which of those viewpoints prevails when they make their final decision.
Last year, the board has what has been described as a tumultuous meeting of controversy in New York, which resulted in the stepping down of several members of the board of directors and the resignation of the executive director, Ben Hooks, who nevertheless claimed that it had nothing to do with that incident. However, with relationship to Justice Thurgood Marshall and his replacement on the Supreme Court, who now, as we know, is Justice Thomas, Mr. Hooks and the NAACP was to some extent out of the loop in that whole discussion. The organization did not come forward with a very strong position for or against Clarence Thomas, and you tell an interesting story about that in the book.
Yes, well, the NAACP was absolutely wishy-washy in that particular case. I think had they not been so, Clarence Thomas probably would not have been confirmed. The story I mention in the book comes out of the Baltimore Sun, where a black writer, Arch Parsons, working for the Baltimore Sun.
And people should know, of course, that the NAACP headquarters are in Baltimore.
That's correct. And the story is, which Arch Parsons admitted, that he was at one point a go-between between Ben Hooks and some of the members of the Judiciary Committee and Thomas, and that he had sort of delivered a pledge that Hooks would not attack Clarence Thomas. I have no knowledge as to the truth of this, except that it has not been effectively denied by anybody I've heard.
Do you have any idea whether that incident played a role in Mr. Hooks's resignation from the executive directorship?
I don't know. All I know is that a lot of members of the board were extremely unhappy about it.
Okay, let's take another telephone call. It's you, caller. You're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good evening.
Good evening.
Mr. Rowan, good evening. This question is with regard to your purpose for writing the book, and is this a historical narrative documenting African Americans in the judicial system, and will you write more historical documents like this?
Well, my purpose in writing the book was to give people, and especially young blacks, an opportunity to understand the life of a really great man, to understand that everybody in America owes Thurgood Marshall a debt. Any woman who aspires to be truly free owes him a debt, because nobody worked harder for women's rights than he did. Somebody in trouble with the criminal justice system today can be thankful to him for making it possible for them to have a lawyer, not only in the trial process, but the sentencing process. This man got a lot of legislation passed and decisions made that make it a little more difficult for cops to beat a confession out of poor people, as so often happens. And that's what I wanted people to understand. Now, am I writing any more historical deals? If I told you I was writing another book tonight, that'd be the end of 42 years of marriage.
Have you gotten the house straight as yet?
She saw the top of her dining room table, but I've still got a lot of stuff in a lot of rooms.
Yes, if he writes another one of those, he'll have to write it away from home. Don't go away. More with Carl Rowan plus your telephone calls when we return. Welcome back. We're talking with syndicated columnist and author Carl Rowan about his new book, Dream Makers, Dream Breakers, about the life and times of Justice Thurgood Marshall, and we will take more of your telephone calls in this segment. But Mr. Rowan, I was shocked when Justice Marshall told you, I am not an honorary member of any club, any place. It was very difficult for me to imagine a Supreme Court justice who did not have a bunch of honorary memberships in clubs.
Well, that was his way of emphasizing to me his comment. Everybody quotes Martin Luther King Jr. saying, free at last, thank God we're free at last. He said, we're not free. I'm not free. And he talked about the Pullman porter who'd been to every city in America and said he'd never been in one, where he had to put his hand up in front of his face to see that he was a Negro. He said, they let you know. And then he was talking about the clubs by way of saying the white socialites in the nation's capital area had let him know that he was still a black man by declining to offer him honorary membership in any club.
Back to your telephone calls. It's your turn. You're on the air, caller. Go ahead, please.
Mr. Rowan, good evening, gentlemen. Mr. Rowan, I wonder if I can ask you two questions. I've heard from time to time there have been some disagreements between yourself and Malcolm X, and I'm not quite sure I know the exact truthfulness of that dialogue, and I wonder if you can expound on that. And secondly, I wonder if I can call on your experience as an ambassador as well as very prominent journalists with respect to the Haitian situation, and wonder what you think can be a way of resolving the crisis at the moment with respect to Aristide returning into power.
Okay, first, Malcolm X.
Well, there was no personal disagreement between me and Malcolm X. I, of course, always disagreed with his talk about separatism or going into two separate states. All of my adult life, I've said if they want to give me Beale Street and Georgia Avenue, I'll take them. But they got to watch me because I'm out for a piece of Wall Street and Madison Avenue too. And I haven't wavered in that particular belief. But beyond that particular bit of philosophy, there was no disagreement between him and me. Now, I have expressed my view that there is the rhetoric of black manhood and there are the deeds of black manhood. I didn't see Malcolm X anywhere around Montgomery or Selma or Birmingham or any of those places when little black girls were getting their heads busted open because they tried to drink a Coca-Cola in some white soda fountain. But I have heard the rhetoric. And I say to people, rhetoric is important. We need some of that. But when I pick my heroes, I want to pick a guy like Thurgood Marshall, who almost lost his life on several cases, or a Martin Luther King, who wrote one of the greatest pieces of prose you'll ever see from a jail in Birmingham.
And as you pointed out, there has always been debate and disagreement between those in the black community who favored integration and those in the black community who favored cultural nationalism or some form of separation, and the debate will continue with people taking either side. What I find interesting is that it seems, and I could be wrong, that Justice Marshall, despite his lifelong struggle for desegregation, maybe there's a distinction to be made here between desegregation and integration, in terms of his own personal life and socializing and personal friends, existed most of his life in a predominantly black environment. Is that correct?
Well, that is correct, except when he wanted to buy a nice house in this area, he did go out to the Lake Barcroft area of Virginia and buy a house.
That's what he fought for.
Well, that's right. I mean,
so he can go any place.
Sure, he won Shelley v. Kramer, one of his great victories in getting the courts to say to white Americans, you can put all the restrictive covenants in you want, but you can't enforce them in the courts of the United States. So he practiced what he preached.
Back to the telephone. You're on the air, caller. Go ahead, please.
Hello. I would like to also say good evening. In response to picking heroes, when I go back, let's start like this. In the beginning, we was both born two things, a sex and a race. And I owe a big obligation to that first race. And if I'm going to hold any, let's say, flags up to anybody, it will be to the black race. And I salute you.
I'm not sure I understand what the caller, but there is an implication that either Thurgood Marshall or Carl Rowan does not see his first obligation being to the black race. I don't understand.
Well, I don't know what you mean by a first obligation. My obligation is to truth and justice, and I will fight for it for anybody, whatever their color may be. For an Hispanic, as quickly as a black man. I don't look at my skin and treasure that to the point that I become a racist.
Back to the telephone. You're on the air, caller. Go ahead, please. Hello, caller. Are you there?
Yes. Good evening. How you doing?
Pretty good.
Yes. My question is, hold on a second.
No, I can't.
All right. All right. My question is, what role do you think, as Kojo and Mr. Rowan here, what role do you think that black journalists should play in the time of '93? Because I feel personally that a lot of so-called black journalists, they don't really be accountable to black issues or to the world issue to black people as a whole in the African diaspora. You know, when the people are really suffering and really, from the black viewpoint, it's not really dealt with in a way as it should be dealt with.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
Well, I think I'll just let my record of 42 years speak for itself. I don't think you'll ever find a time when I shrinked away from the fight.
I think that truth and integrity are the two most important characteristics of any journalist, and I think that a black journalist has a historical obligation to follow in the way of our forefathers and make sure that that commitment to truth and integrity allows us to be better than we are expected to be at all times, and never to shy away from controversy because we feel that somehow we're going to be accused of not being loyal enough to the race. There are a lot of issues that you will see published in small black newspapers in this country, especially in the southern United States, that you won't see published in any other newspaper, and it is out of that tradition that people like Mr. Rowan and I come, and we just feel, I know I speak for him, that we can't let those people down. Let me get back to the telephone. You're on the air, caller. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I am a recent law school graduate, and while I was in school studying the law, I felt that my professors and my co-students did not think that Justice Marshall was as competent as the other justices on the court, that his opinions were as well written. And since his death, I read an article by Juan Williams, who indicated in the article that Justice Marshall also felt this put down, if that's what you want to call it, and that was a part of some of the bitterness or the gruffness that came across in his manner. Can you comment on that?
Certainly. The book addresses it.
Yes, you will see this in the book, and you will see enough of the writings and opinions of Justice Marshall to see that some of the phrases, the conclusions, are going to last as long as we have a judiciary system in this country. You see, there always has been a systematic effort to put down Justice Marshall. There are people who never would walk away from the fact that, or their claim, that he was really not qualified. He was on the court as a black token. Well, those are the same people in my profession of journalism. There will always be some second-rate white guy out there who says, this black guy, Rowan, he must have gotten all those things as tokens over all of these years, because they don't want to walk away from the reality that there might be some blacks superior to them in intellect and integrity and skill.
And when Justice Marshall decided to walk away from the Supreme Court, despite his denial that anger, frustration, and bitterness had anything to do with it, the book seems to suggest that, yes, it did have a lot to do with it.
Well, yes, you know, you look at that press conference, but beyond that, the day before, at the dissent he wrote, in which he lashed out angrily at the court, saying that the currency of its decision-making no longer was reason, but only power. And you know, this was a man unhappy that over 12 years they changed the court to a point where they were wiping away some of his life work. But let me say one more thing about those people who tried to put him down. I think you got the final answer when 19,000 people stood out in the cold to walk past his body as it lay in state.
Indeed, Justice Thurgood Marshall. The book is called Dream Makers, Dream Breakers. We have to take a short break. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back. That's our show for tonight. As we said, the name of the book, Dream Makers, Dream Breakers. Our thanks to our esteemed colleague, Carl Rowan, for joining us here this evening. And the book is already in its fourth printing, and it seems like there are going to be a lot more.
Well, thank you very much. Pleasure being with you.
And of course, thanks to you for participating in Evening Exchange. On the 11th of March, we showed you the wonderful artwork of 5 African-American female artists. However, we did not mention where you will be able to see the exhibit, and we of course apologize for that. So here are the dates and times of that exhibit. From a woman's perspective, the art of African women is on display until March 29, 1993 at the Baltimore World Trade Center on the 27th floor, 401 East Pratt Street, Baltimore, Maryland. For information, the number is area code 301-372-8810.